central to the ideas behind my work, and the place that I've called home for the last 2 years is the traditional land of the Duwamish people, and that has importance to me in general, but in particular because of the nature of my work. I started this year researching using local materials, and some of the clay that I used in the pots and as a slip on the pots in the show came from this area. And so this place has even more significance to me because of that. And I think my search for wanting to use local materials has guided my my process and my decisions and my thoughts for the last year, in part because I want my work to be connected to a time and a place. And, you know, that's sort of the crux of why I decided to call this show home. This time that we're in, we've been stuck in our homes like never before. And the foundation for this show sort of started for me during March and April, when I was living in Capitol Hill in Seattle and wasn't able to come to the studio or make work, and had a lot of angsty time to think. And you know, my relationship with my home, along with everyone's, changed a lot during that time. And so that was sort of where this show started. But I'm going to share my screen here and jump into a PowerPoint that I have just to talk a little bit about the work. So I'm going to spend about 10 minutes or so talking about some of the ideas behind this work, and then Liz Quackenbush is going to get on and join me for a conversation, but I'll introduce her in a little bit. So this is the layout of the show in the gallery space. Like I was saying, I had a lot of time to think about what my home meant to me and what I wanted from my home in March and April. More time than I would have liked, but it made me realize some of the things that I value and appreciate and was missing during that time. I was really missing group company, having people over. I was fortunate to be living in a house with some close friends of mine. There were 6 of us in total, and we often did have group dinners. We were cooking for each other and making big meals and sharing them, and thinking about having people around a table was on my mind a lot, and the pots that one might want for that occasion. I'm also about to embark on a new journey. I'm moving to Missoula, Montana tomorrow, if everything goes well. And we'll be living with my partner there in our cute little home, and setting it up with her in September when she moved there. I had a new appreciation for what a home could be. I've always lived with friends in group houses, and that is a lot of fun, but I've never felt like a space was my own. And starting to think of what a space could be and the pots that I could display, the pots that I've had hidden in boxes because I've been too worried about someone breaking them. All of a sudden, I could display them, and I could put them on the counter and use them. And all of a sudden, I had the urge to make forms that I've actually never been too interested in making. I've always I've felt pressure to make jars, but I've never been particularly interested in jars. And all of a sudden I had a big counter to put jars out on the counter and to use them, and to make oil cruets. That was a new form for me that I really was excited about, using oil and vinegar cruets. And so when I came back from Missoula in September and started making the work for the show about a month and a half ago, I really started making work that had never appealed to me before, but all of a sudden I was really excited about it. And usually my making process is a bit more elongated than it was. I crammed a lot into the last month and a half, as the people close to me can attest to. But it was really exciting to have ideas developing so quickly. I don't know that there are too many times where that can happen, except right before a deadline, right before a show, or an ending to something. So I'm very proud, and I'm also really excited about the new ideas that have been forming for me. Here are a couple more images from the show. There's a jar and a platter in the image on the left, and on the right are a series of cheese boards, I'm calling them, that were inspired based on wooden cutting boards. All of this was more objects that I could envision hanging on a wall or being displayed in a home, and used as well, but objects that to me created a home from a blank canvas, from a blank wall. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the cheese boards in a minute, so I'm going to go on to the next slide. During that the time in April, my roommates had a set of these very classic pasta bowl forms on the right that you see. They are sort of the archetypal Italian, French fine cuisine bowls. And I was thinking a lot during that time about why they're so nice to use and to eat from, that wide rim, what that does for the food and the display. And thinking about what kind of pots I want in my home, while I usually gravitate towards picking out handmade pots from a cupboard, I found myself in April using these pasta bowls sometimes and really enjoying it. And so I started thinking at that point about where the inspiration for those bowls has come from and how that relates to my work. And I've always gravitated towards Japanese and Korean pots. More recently have been exploring some European historical ceramics, English, but I think my primary interest in ceramics has always been in Korean pots and Japanese pots. And I was interested where the idea of this European form, this pasta bowl, could intersect with the Japanese or Korean aesthetic. And this was my variation, my attempt at that, to create a shape that I thought would be an enjoyable serving experience and eating experience, but that also paid homage to multiple different aesthetic historical choices. So that the line that you can see that runs through that bowl is a pretty Japanese aesthetic that was created by just dipping the piece in glaze on each half of it and leaving the line in between it. So done quickly and not fussed over. And I'm proud of where these bowls came from and where they're going. I think this form led me to want to explore this idea with other pots to eat from. So I did a series of plates that also sort of referenced some of my favorite historical ceramics. This is a plate on the left that's from Japan. There's a Japanese potter, Rosanjin, that made work in the early 1900s and throughout the first half of the 1900s. And the technique of using dark clay with a white slip is liquid clay, if you're not familiar with that, and using a white slip on top of dark clay has always been really alluring to me. I love the depth in that surface. And so thinking about this rim and how the proportions of a pot can lead one to want to use it in different contexts was really exciting to me. And so when I came back into the studio after it reopened this summer, I was really excited for the first time really about making tableware, making a lot of plates and bowls to be eaten from. During the main part of quarantine, I lived 2 blocks from Volunteer Park, which is in Capitol Hill here in Seattle. And I spent a lot of time running and walking in Volunteer Park during that time. So if you're from Seattle, you might recognize the water tower in Volunteer Park on the left. And as I mentioned earlier, my interest in making jars really got me excited. I got excited in September to focus on making pots that contained and embellished a home. And so when I was trying to think of forms that inspired me, I gravitated towards structures. And I've never been interested in making pots before that reference architecture, but the idea of a home being a containing unit is so real right now. We're so contained in our homes, and jars contain, that's what they do. We put things in them. And I gravitated towards, I started making different jars and playing around with different forms that referenced homes, referenced structures and buildings. And this water tower in Volunteer Park has stuck with me for its architecture and the proportions of those lines as they're going up, and the windows at the top. There's something else that I just realized last week too that has been in the back of my mind. There's been this oil drum out in the kiln yard for the last month at Pottery Northwest, because they've been doing a pit firing class, and they were using this oil drum to fire work in. And I love those ridges in this oil drum and the color. I mean, the patina of that is clearly something I've been striving for in my own work, that appearance of time and material intersecting together. And so I got curious. I was wondering what those ridges are for, and they actually have a function, of course, because they wouldn't be there otherwise. An oil drum is not an object made for its aesthetic purpose, but this oil drum, those ridges help it roll, so they roll them. And then it got me wondering, so I'm going to go back to the previous slide, those ridges in the water tower, well, they must have a function too, and I'm sure it's a structural function helping support the structure of the building. Clearly I'm not going to be rolling my jar on its side on the countertop, but it's important for me to reference the aesthetic of those decisions in the oil drum and the water tower, even if I'm not using the ridges for the same function. So this is a jar of mine on the left that I made in the last couple months that you can see clearly the aesthetic choices of myself trying to mimic the effects of time on a material. I found myself lately actually drawn to the materials of metal and wood a lot more than I ever have been before. I've always actually shied away from making pots and making objects that reference directly another material. I go back in my head to conversations I've had with different mentors or people I've worked for about, clay being really good at making pots. Clay is really good at making pots, and there are some things that clay is not good at doing. Clay can be really brittle and fragile compared to something like wood. But I love the the ability of wood to withstand time and to show the effects of time in the surface. And I grew interested. I was starting to look at the way that metal showed the effects of time, wood showed the effects of time, and I wondered what these wooden objects could do as a ceramic object. And it wasn't until after I fired these actually, and was having a conversation with Liz Quackenbush, who is going to get on in a minute, that I realized actually that these cheese boards, as I'm calling them on the left, don't have to try to be the wooden object. They can do something that the wooden object can't, which is they can hold heat and they can go in the oven. And so all of a sudden, these objects that I drew my inspiration from wood transcended what the wooden object itself could do. And I thought that sort of blew my mind when Liz and I were talking about that. I had a lot of fun setting these up. These were another experiment that I started making in the last month and a half, not knowing where it was going to go, not knowing if I might be happy with it in the end. But it was a lot of fun to see these come out of the kiln and take them in, and I'm excited to keep pushing them. Sort of the last thing I'm going to show here before I get on with Liz is these ceramic paintings, I'm calling them, which were another big experiment for me in the last couple months. They're big, thick slabs of clay. They're about 20 inches long and 2 or 3 inches wide. And they came from a desire to explore the surfaces that I want on my pots, but to take away the functional aspect in use. And I was really interested, and I've always been really interested in the surfaces that I'm getting on my pots and the natural colors, the effects of time and material coming together. And I was interested to try to capture that surface on a canvas. And my material is clay, and clay doesn't stick to a canvas very well. And so I made the canvas, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen with these, but it's been a lot of fun to explore them, and I'm excited to do more with that. I've always loved making pots, and I've always been in love working with clay. This fall actually is the 10-year anniversary of me starting to work with clay. And as much as I love working with clay, I'm really interested in making objects for a home. Clay just happens to be the material that I really enjoy working with. So even though these paintings don't really exist in the vernacular of pottery, they are objects for a home, and that's how I saw them. So I think that's a good stopping point for me. I'm gonna exit my screen here, and I want to introduce, I want to introduce Liz Quackenbush, who's gonna get on with me in a second. Liz moved out to Seattle about a year ago from Pennsylvania, came across the country, didn't know too many people here, and she came to Pottery Northwest one day. I think her original plan was to be here for a month or a month and a half, and after renovating our studio, she ended up staying here for about 5 months, 4 or 5 months, and for a lot of that time she ended up working directly across from my studio. And she became a friend and a mentor to me, someone that I was able to bounce ideas off of and talk about pots. Liz was a professor at Penn State and is a fantastic artist and potter herself. And it's been a lot of fun to have someone in my life here who is so excited to talk about pots and the history of pots as I am. So we had this idea to come together and have a dialogue about pots to make this event a little more interesting. So, hi, Liz.
Hi, let's hope that's what happens. Well, I just want to say thank you to Pottery Northwest for having me and for welcoming this opportunity to have fun with your opening and to try to sort of bring it to life through this Zoom meeting. I also have just spent so many days and evenings talking to Jake about his work over the course of my year here in Seattle that it's really fun to share some of where that conversation's come to at this point. So hopefully it'll be fun and we won't go on too long. But I'm in the gallery, and so it's really great because I get to pick up the work and show people what it is to really interact with the work, which as far as pottery is concerned, that's super important. So that's part of what I'm doing here today. I'm trying to think of what else I wanted to say to just introduce. I guess that's it. So I have a bunch of questions, and often I would contradict Jake and ask him what he really meant or why he thought what he was thinking. And so some of that I'm sure will happen here today. But we are friends, and so none of it is done with any kind of hostile intent. Okay, so when I first got here, I'm gonna pick up a piece. Should I be on the bigger screen or on the smaller screen?
I already messaged James about that. We can't change it.
Okay.
Go ahead, you talk.
So when I first got here, Jake's studio was full of pottery, and the most eye-catching things that I noticed were pots that were inspired by Korean pottery. And that was the work that jumped out to me the most right off the bat. And really over this last year, I've been amazed at the development of the work. It's really come a long way. And certainly just since June or July, it's taken another huge leap. But it's been super fun to sort of be up to date with what's going on. So I'm just going to start with this piece, which is a pour over of Jake's. And the Korean part for me is where these cutouts happen. And what this cup looks a lot like something that's like a metal that's been driven over by a truck for many years into an impression of some kind of a metal grate or something. There's a wonderful tactility and sort of plasticity to the surface of this cup. And I'm really interested in that. But then the Korean pottery is so architectural. And so when you said earlier that you really hadn't been interested in architecture until recently in houses, I thought of these Korean pots and I thought, they're totally architectural. And you were looking at them before I got here. So anyway, what's fun about this piece for me is that I look in here, and that's where you would see all this coffee going through being filtered. And so it sort of lets you into this dark space, and not only do you hear it better, but you also can kind of visualize it through these windows that are happening in the base of the pour-over part. What do you think about that, Jake?
Yeah, well, I was really happy about that form when I started making it. Because for me, it was actually the first time that I felt like I addressed a historical pot in a modern context. And I was looking at these pots and I loved them from the Silla dynasty in Korea. And they were made almost 2,000 years ago, and they had these cutouts like the one that Liz is showing. And
just like this part of the pot.
Yeah. And I didn't know how a pot like that would relate to our contemporary lives. But I had been using a pour over for a while, a ceramic one, and I kept having to lift it up off the cup to see how much more water to keep pouring so that I didn't overflow it. And so those cutouts became, it was the first time that I was looking at a historical pot and put it into a modern context for me. And that was a lot of fun.
So the function sort of invited this invention.
Yeah.
Yeah, often people think that pottery is limited in its creative scope because it's got so many demands on it. But there you go. There's an opportunity that you found where you brought it to life. And I think the handle on this is a really great sturdy handle that goes along with this sort of metally relationship. And then I love the pour over going back in time for me. So that's one of my sort of more favorite things, although there's a lot that I love in here. How about this one? I keep looking at this one. So there's architecture implied in a pot like this, even when it's not so apparent as putting windows or stacking layers like the water tower does. Can you talk about the architecture of a vessel like this?
Yeah, you know, for pictures especially, the architecture that I see is more as it relates to a human figure. It's all I can think about with pictures, or at least an animal figure where there's a belly to the form, and that band that goes around the middle is some kind of belt or some kind of cinching action that cinches the volume in, and then you have a handle that really references an arm and a spout that looks like a neck. So all of these components, I've always loved making pictures. It was the first form that I felt like I wanted to focus on and spend a lot of time on to try to perfect or to make a picture that I would want to use. I think I always, when I first started making or getting really into making pots, I would think about the picture that my family had growing up. We had a Josh DeWeese picture, and it wasn't out on the table every night. You know, we would have it out when we had people over or for a holiday or something. But I loved having that picture out on the table. It was such a strong, beautiful pot, and it's sort of a centerpiece object in a way. It rests in the middle of the table, and my eye is always drawn to pictures. So yeah, I'm curious though, what architecture do you think of with that picture or pictures in general?
Well, I think that you're right, it is very figurative. The cinching in here, to me, welcomes the use. The fact that it's so inflated through this part of the pot makes it seem like it's just full, even when it's not full, so it seems natural for it to be filled up with water or milk or something else that you want to drink and share. So I think that part is super important to a picture, having it reference its fullness, and because of that, it becomes kind of generous, and that's what I like about this particular picture. It's doing all of that. And then this part, it seems as if it's cinched in from a taller form, but it also feels sort of like this part is stacked on this. And so I actually visually sort of break this pot down into 3 sections where it's like up to here, and then this part, and then this part. And so that's doing things that are kind of similar to what's going on in the stacked pot that you have here, in terms of proportion and sort of defining different sections of the pot. I know you talked about these in relation to the metal can and the water tower, but to me they represent bento boxes, where it would be like a stack of boxes, which is also an architectural decision, but in reference to a functional form. And so the idea of it splitting up and becoming like different functions, sort of needs within one vessel, is really interesting to me. And I keep thinking that there's an opportunity here for that to be explored also. But these feel so good in the hand, and the way that each layer sort of dips in is great for, first off, grabbing the pot and holding on nice and tight, but also the way that it sort of sucks in here is really nice for when you take the lid off. And having this lip come out, my hands aren't quite big enough, but I actually purchased a pot sort of like this out of Jake's show. And my husband, who's got hands that are much bigger, he could reach over that lip and carry it across the room to bring to his Mr. Coffee in the morning to use it as a coffee canister. The surfaces on these pots are very seductive. One thing that's super hard with clay is to make the clay seem as beautiful as when it's damp after it's all finished and fired. And there's something about the patina that you've got on this chocolatey clay that is so similar to that dampness of leather hard clay. How did you do that?
Well, that's the struggle, isn't it? I feel I've heard so many potters talk about wanting to capture that moment when the clay is wet, and people do it in such different ways, right? But I agree with you. I love the allure of the clay when it's not quite squishy anymore, but it's still wet and malleable. I think ceramic artists across the board just love that stage of clay. I've been trying to figure out a way to capture that for 5 years now. And, you know, every time I get close to it, something else draws my interest and I go in a different direction. But I'm pretty pleased with that patina that you're talking about. It's actually a really simple, it's a red art is a type of earthenware clay, and red art is it's a low fire clay for those of you who don't know, but it actually starts to vitrify and become glass-like at a high temperature and form a glaze on its own. And so that is actually just red art, has a slip on the inside of that lid and the inside of the pot. And around cone 9 or 10, it gets into a really soft, lovely, yeah.
I love how the inside of the pot has that feeling of just dampness, because it references the human body or any kind of living body where the moisture is on the inside. And so it's another body reference and metaphor in the pot when you open it up and you see something that's just naturally sort of emanating that kind of dampness.
Yeah, that's cool. I hadn't thought of that. I mean, I'm always trying to think about how the pots are going to relate to each other. So it was a clear decision to relate that picture to the form of the jar with those bands, but I like that there's more references that go together too.
Yeah, it's fun to really tangle them up and have some be subtle and some sort of surprise you. And it's nice when pots have enough going on that they reveal themselves over time, that they're complicated. Yeah. You don't see it all in one shot.
And for myself, usually I am working at a slower pace than I have been the last month. My work usually informs what I make next. And so usually I have more time when I unload a kiln to digest it and sit with the work. And sometimes I'll take it home and use it or look at it. And that wasn't happening for me in the last month and a half. I didn't get that time because I was firing kilns almost every week. And so when I was firing a kiln, I was already making the work for the next kiln. And so I wasn't digesting as much as normal in between the firings, and was relying a bit more on the work I'd done ahead of time and just intuition and flying by the seat of my pants. But yeah, it's fun. I'm learning about it still because I didn't get to live with it as much as it came out of the kiln.
You show that you have had enough, or that you had enough information to work with to pull off some nice work. There's a nice detail in the lid where you have this little square that's pushed into the middle of that lid, and it's as if this little buttony thing here was taken and just left a little dimple, like a little fossil there in the lid. So anyway, well, there's a number of pieces that I really want to talk about, but I have one of these here. And Jake and I have spent some time really talking about these. And this piece in particular has that patina that we just romanced, and I feel strongly about all over the top of it. It's really beautiful, but you also get this, you get two things going on this pot. It feels like it's been scraped into its shape. There's sort of scratch marks that aren't deep, but they're still visible. And then the softness of some kind of a slick that's smeared across the surface. And so the tactile quality of the surface of this pot is very seductive. Do you have anything you'd like to say about that part of it?
No, well, I guess the texture was a very conscious effort to scratch into the surface when the clay was the right amount of dryness. There's some sand and grog in the clay, and so when the clay has dried just so, you can pull a piece of metal across it and the sand comes to the surface and is dragged across. And so that's a texture that I really like and wanted to achieve on that surface. The handprints that you're talking about were totally happen chance on that. And yeah, I agree. It's really shows the time of the piece. I mean, it was a cool.
Yeah, there's something about cheese that's so much about texture. Mm-hmm. And it just seems like it really lends itself as a cheese board. To me, you know, depends so much on the crackers and the density or fluidity of the cheese. And, you know, these are so nice. I have one I've talked to Jake about that's made of an old slate shingle and that I use as a cheese board. And it's wonderful because you can chill it or you can warm it up, and all of that affects the cheese depending on what you're serving. And so it's a really nice functional piece, and it looks beautiful on the wall when you're not using it. Okay, so in contrast to that, which is so functional, this piece, do I have it right side? Yes, it's the right side up. This piece is so out of character to me because it's not a pot, and you talked about that. But what I find really funny about this piece is that I make this brownie recipe that is an old made-a-heater brownie recipe. She used to make all these brownies, this famous baker. She used to make tons of brownies. She always had them in her purse. She would hand them out as she would go through her day to anybody she would meet, you know, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. Everybody would get a brownie. So in the recipe, my mother gave me her old made-a-heater cookie book. And in the recipe, you make a sheet of brownies and you pull the whole thing out like this, and then you saw it apart. And they really are delicious brownies, but I can't help but think of this as a big block of brownies. However, the surface is nothing like a brownie. The surface is really stunning. And I know you can't see it that well on the Zoom, on the Zoom screen, but you can see it sort of sparkling. Is that the feldspar, or are those just, what's going on this, Jake? I mean, it's really, you have 3 of these and they're all vastly different, but this one's the most subtle.
Yeah, so those are all a combination of local clays that I dug and some clays that I got from commercial mines, and they're soda fired. And so all of that surface, for the most part, is coming from the sodium glaze that I spray into the kiln. But I wanted something more interesting to the surface. And so I actually added a lot of, what is it called? Perlite is the material that you put in planters, in potted plants, that it actually burns out of the piece, and so it left all of those cavities in the surface, and that just adds some depth to what's going on there. Yeah, I know that you talked about the not knowing where those fit in with the vernacular of pots, and I don't know either. I've never been interested in making clay objects that don't have some sort of function in the past.
It's interesting because when I first met you, you were starting a class on raw materials. And this is very much about just raw material. That it's like just clay and glaze. Excuse me? Oh. And you really need to love clay and glaze in order to appreciate this piece. I mean, it's very seductive, but of course I'm a clay and glaze lover. So anyway, it's really something. It's quite beautiful. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that area of play, that comes when you sort of abandon the structure of pottery making and found yourself just going off on this whim. And what do you think that did for the pottery when you went back to making pottery, if you had a chance to do that, or how that all happened, and how much room you think you give yourself to spread yourself, to dabble outside of those boundaries of pottery?
I think I was able to rationalize those pieces under the same umbrella as the pots, in that they are all objects for a home. And that has always sort of guided my making of pots, is that they are objects that people want to live with in their homes. And the paintings actually started after I was having conversations this summer with a friend of mine who was quitting her job and was about to start making these paintings full time. And just through talking about it, I realized that paintings have such a different connotation with people than pots. The capital A art lives in a different world than pots do most of the time. And for the most part, I want to exist in the world that pots do. I want them to be accessible and affordable. But there's something about objects for a home that are revered and on a wall and looked at, that I wanted to explore, and I wanted to see if I could capture what I'm looking for in the surface of the clay in this canvas that might be.
Well, a lot of potters find when they want to try something out on the wall, what do? They make a big platter and they put it up on the wall. I love that you stepped outside of that even and just really got down to the rawness of that material, and just left it at that. I know you said you pushed this clay into a plaster drying mold, and just that you used what tools you had on hand in order to just respond to that impulse, I think is really great. I think that's wonderful.
Thanks. I'm excited.
Well, I really just have one more piece that I'd like to, well, that's not true, but I'm not sure how long people want to listen.
I was going to say 15.
So,
maybe only do one more.
okay. So this pot is a beauty. And again, it's got this amazing skin to the surface of it. I mean, this pot is just such a nice sort of a physical and body-related image kind of pot. Of course, it's very sort of traditional with the high shoulder. It's definitely got sort of a male body going on versus a lower center of gravity. It would be more of a feminine shape. But I love how you've got these little dimples in here. And they remind me so much of a belly button, but there's no pinching to them. They don't feel like you've pinched the clay. You said you put a tool in there instead. But somehow the way you've softened it up with sponging and with the slip that you put over the surface, it's really, they're very, very tactile and beautiful. I mean, this pot is so much about the silhouette because of how dark it is and how much light it absorbs. And I really think the variation is interesting and just gorgeous. The way that you talked about patina in relation to the big tank, or what do you call it, can of water, the oil or whatever that was used for, the oil drum, was it just seems like you've got that patina on this, so that idea that whatever you put on here, which is probably the iron oxide, looks like it's been oxidized, that it's gone through a transition, and that you've captured it in that moment is really very, very beautiful. So anyway, that's a big thing, Jake. I know you're happy with this one, and I
Yeah.
see.
When I made that, I was making a whole series of bowls and some plates that I actually didn't end up using in the show that had those dimples as well in them. And when I was making them, I was thinking about metal, the way that metal can be dented in, because that related to the surface of the piece. But it is funny how the form, the way that those dimples lie right in the belly, it's undeniably like a belly button. Yeah.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thanks, Jake, for once again discussing your work with me. I really appreciate it. Everybody should know that the work is for sale online through Pottery Northwest, and there's more beautiful pottery here than I had a chance to show you. So that's all online, right, Jake?
Yep.
Yeah, and so.
And then for the people in Seattle, it will remain in the gallery for the next month, I think, or maybe into December as well. But some people on here, Pottery Northwest people who've been coming back into the studio. So feel free to check it out and handle the pots. I want you to pick them up if you are able to and you're here. And we'll put some hand sanitizer in there so you can use that after you touch them. But yeah, I wanted to thank Pottery Northwest, thank James and all of the staff for helping make this happen, because like James said, it's the only thing that remained constant in the schedule this year, and if nothing else, I am stubborn. So, it really helped me, having this show helped me get through the last 6 months, all the changes in the world and my life, and yeah, so thank you.